I'll be speaking with Ali Al Ahmed, a Saudi researcher and human rights activist. He's a regular guest on CBS News, CNN, PBS, Al Jazeera, and others. He's speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for having me.
On March 12th, Saudi officials executed 81 people in one day. You tweeted about it. You said 40 or so were activists who had merely taken part in protests. Could you explain?
Yes, the majority of those who are 50% or more are Shia Arabs. 40 of them were arrested on charges of protesting against the government. One was accused of spying because he had a visit or invited an Iranian diplomat over for dinner because he lived nearby. So the rest were mixed of Yemenis who are against the war or and other militants from supposedly ISIS who were accused of bombing and fighting with the Saudi forces. All of these trials all of the 81 trials do not meet any standards acceptable around the world. And the Saudi courts obviously do not have the processes that you can consider to be fair or legal in any country, basically in any other country around the world. The mass execution came on the orders of Mohammed bin Salman himself. Such mass execution cannot be carried out on an order of a minister. It has to come from the king or the royal court. And as the king is not able to conduct his duties, like everybody knows, because of his age and illness, it is MBS who had decided to carry on and order these unnecessary, really, executions. Like I said, most of these people were executed for their opinions or for protest, not for anything. Most of them did not kill anyone. Most of them, even those who are accused of being members of ISIS.
Now, you mentioned Shia. I think many of our viewers would be surprised. They tend to think Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi, all Sunni. What percent of the people are Shia?
Well, it's very hard to say, but in my own research, I think between 20 to 25%. We have a problem that Saudi Arabia is a closed country in terms of the freedom of information, freedom of research, and also in freedom of religion. For example, I have written this over 20 years ago when I found that there are many Shia in Saudi Arabia who do not, who hide their faith because they live in areas where being Shia makes you a target and deprives you from economic and educational opportunities. So many people hide their faith outside the traditional Shia areas in the east and some in the west. Outside these regions, people tend to hide the fact that they are Shia Muslims.
Because the general attitude of the government and the leaders of the Saudi Arabia is intolerant.
The Saudi state is, without a doubt, is an anti-Shia state from the king, MBS, and the entire sort of Saudi elite, basically, because they view Shia as a threat, and that's something they have said in public and privately. So there is no doubt about it. This is like day and night. Obviously, this has not been talked about very much in the West because, it's one of our allies and that's their culture and so on. So this idea that Saudi Arabia, the state is a tolerant government toward its citizens is not true. Shia I think is a prime example of that, because if you are a Shia, you cannot even be a mayor. There is not a single mayor in Saudi Arabia who's a Shia, or let alone a minister or a judge or even like a military officer or a military pilot. It's not allowed. It's in the Saudi system. It's not been published but we know it exists because we have access to these sort of secret regulations that they have in the Saudi state that says that Saudi Shia are not allowed to occupy these positions. And I'll give you a very simple example. The Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. was opened in 1948. Since 1948 until 2022, there hasn't been a single Shia Saudi in that embassy who worked as a diplomat. Zero, zilch. The same thing happens in the UN Saudi UN mission. That has been zero since 1947, 48. And recently, in fact, the Saudi ambassador to the United Nations made bigoted remarks in the General Assembly against Shia, and nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything to him.
Of the people who were executed, did the families get the bodies? Were they returned?
No. Saudi Arabia has this sort of draconian and ugly practice of not giving the bodies of the victims, of people who it executes, to their family, and it just steals or snatches their body. And we're talking now about hundreds of people who have been executed for political reasons or for political crimes. And so we are looking at a few hundred people who have not been returned, their bodies have not been returned to their family members.
For instance, Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who was executed in 2016.
Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr is a prime example, but we're talking about many others who either were killed or in the streets in protests or in their cars or being executed. So hundreds of people who were their bodies still have been snatched by the Saudi state. And it's important to note this. This is done without any legal process within the Saudi system itself. So this is obviously this is a crime, but I have not seen the United Nations or any quote unquote civilized government speak about it, let alone condemn this practice. I mean,
that brings us to the U.S. reaction, the government reaction to the executions. How would you describe it?
I mean, there was no reaction. In fact, I think a reporter tried to get a reaction from the State Department spokesman, Ned Price, and he refused to say anything about it. I mean, that, in my opinion, I think that was the best outcome, because if he had said something, he would have claimed to have, to care about these things. He, just saying a word here and there and try to pretend that you care, but at the same time you don't. I think you get some points by some people. You fool some people. So in a way, in my opinion, I think it was best that Ned Price and whichever state that really do not care about these victims, I think it would insult their memory. So I was not expecting. I mean, there is not a change in U.S. policy.
But didn't Biden say he was going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah?
I mean, I think Biden, is a very pragmatic. He's a political animal who have said this before, have done things that within the U.S. context that were considered racist and bigoted, and then he shifted. We all know he voted for that crime bill that targeted Black people, and of course now he changed his tune. He's a politician, and he's going to say whatever gets him elected and keeps him in power. And I don't myself think of Biden or Blinken or any other leader as a moral authority on human rights. I would not believe anything that they say until I see it happen. Their words do not mean much. I mean, that's the nature of politics, unfortunately.
So let's go back now to the executions. You tweeted on March 14th, "You can't make this up." 2 days after the Saudis massacred 81 protesters and others, senior U.S. official in charge of promoting democracy and human rights, praises Saudi official who was in charge of mass executions, torture, and other human rights crimes, in addition to his anti-Semitism. Could you explain?
Yes, Mohammad Al-Issa came to Washington in those days and met with Asra. I forgot her name now. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Labor, and Human Rights, and she is the highest Muslim official ever in the State Department. So she received Mohammad Al-Issa, the Saudi official, at her office and praised him. Mohammad Al-Issa was the Saudi Minister of Justice, and he established what people call terrorism court, the same court that has that basically rendered these execution or these death penalties against the 81 and many others, and also prosecuted human rights activists and women rights activists like Rujan Al-Hadloul and others. He is the one who built this court and engineered it and set the laws. And in fact, legally, these sentences were carried under a code that Mohammad Al-Issa, when he was the head of the Saudi court, he was also the president of the Supreme Court and other courts. So he built the laws and the legal narrative to give the Saudi state the right to execute people for non-capital crimes, and that's called ta'zir in the code. In the code. So he made this. He codified it because before then, the Saudi state, it was repressive, but it did not carry executions against people who did not kill, who did not commit capital crimes like murder and bombing and so on. So, but this court carried hundreds of or rendered hundreds of death penalties because it was Al-Issa who designed, and he was the architect of this court and these laws, and he modernized it to be more efficient. So he is really a person who he's now the head of something called the World Muslim League, which is a Saudi government front, and it's a part of the public relation campaign that they have been waging. And so he is guilty in these crimes. So for the US to say we promote democracy around the world and then not only receive him, I would understand if you have to work with bad people. I totally do. But at the same time, you receive him 2 days after killing 81 people and praising him for combating anti-Semitism. In fact, we had a report last year detailing his sermons, calling Jews evil and eternally evil. That's what really disturbing. Sometimes, if you call Ali Al Ahmed is a bad guy, but if you say Ali Al Ahmed and his offsprings are all bad, that is like way above the sort of, So it was a disgusting part, there were disgusting sermons, and we translated them and we shared them. I know there are people within the Jewish community who are, washing his image because now he has established relationship with some of the sort of right-wing Jewish entities in this country and are praising him, including the last ambassador to combat anti-Semitism and others who said Al-Issa is a great guy. When we showed them the sermons, they said, oh, this was old. But so they only focused on one issue. So you can kill, you can torture, you can do this. As long as you say, oh, I'm combating anti-Semitism, you are now.
I saw they took him to Auschwitz. And
yes.
He did the usual.
But a few years before he went to Auschwitz, look what he said about Jews. So if you are 60 years old and you've been saying this for 60 years and 6 months now you change your opinion, I would not forget what you did over the past 60 years. And while you continue to engage in massive human rights violations like executing protesters, including children, torture and abuse of women's rights, and sectarian and carry on apartheid courts, because the Saudi courts are apartheid courts. You like it or not, they are apartheid courts, because you are not allowed in the Saudi court system to be a judge if you are black or Shia or a woman or non-Wahhabi. And this is apartheid. Some people are uncomfortable saying it, but this is the fact. And if they're not comfortable with it, it's up to them. But we are going to speak. We'll say, no matter who you are, if you praise a human right criminal, you are engaging in supporting these crimes and in massacre denial and all of that, all of these bad things. You can't excuse this meeting and the praising of this very bad individuals. I'm surprised that he was even allowed into the United States, because the U.S. law stipulate that a person engaging in this is automatically barred from entering the United States.
What about the one seemingly good piece of news, the release of Raif al-Badawi after 10 years in prison?
Yeah, Raif Badawi, his case is one of those cases that really is a tragedy in many ways, because Raif Badawi spent over 10 years in prison for basically doing nothing. And his release, people were joyful and say it's great news, but 10 years, you spend 10 years in prison for doing no crime. And then when you leave prison, you're not allowed to leave the country, and you're not even allowed, and you're too worried or too afraid to publish a picture or to open a Twitter account. Raif Badawi continues to be a prisoner within the Saudi big prison. Saudi Arabia is a big prison. So Saudi Arabia releasing him from a small prison to a big prison I don't think it's good news. He's maybe able to call his wife and kids in Canada, but he's not free. And I noticed one thing, that none of those people who carried water and made him into the champion he was and the icon he was, the State Department said nothing about him after his release. And none of those European states have said anything about him. Even the Canadian government, where his kids and wife didn't say anything. I must say, for historical purposes here, Raif Badawi's case was used by many in the West to cover up or to distract from real cases. Raif was never this personality within the country that had any sort of influence or much of influence comparing to others like Dr. Mohammad Al-Qahtani and Abdullah Al-Hamid and Namr and other sort of national figures who actually advocated for democracy, for human rights, who faced the government down. And their cases happened at the same time where Raif Badawi's case happened. But I think there was a sinister goal here, is to use Raif Badawi's case to hide, to create a shield away from the cases of like what we call Hasm, Dr. Al-Qahtani, Al-Hamid, and other intellectuals who created a movement within the country demanding a constitutional monarchy, an elected parliament. And these people's cases did not receive 10% or 5% of the attention that Raif Badawi's case received, and none of them received awards and prizes that Raif Badawi received. And Raif Badawi, like I said, he is not a writer. He doesn't even have a high school degree. But unfortunately, we live in a time where creating these fake personalities or icons happen. And this is one case where we saw that. And I have these discussions with several of these organizations that wanted only to talk about Raif Badawi, but ignore sort of the more important figures. This is not to say Raif Badawi should not receive attention, but in terms of the totality of the situation in the country, there were other pressing cases. And more important, if we were interested in promoting democracy and human rights and freedoms of all types. Other individuals their cases were much more interesting and influential in terms on the ground in that country. And you Dr. Ghani, PhD from Temple University, from Indiana, I'm sorry, and others who have PhDs and intellectuals, these people should have been focused upon.
Let's move on to Yemen now. Is there actually a truce between the Saudis and the Yemeni Ansar Allah forces?
Yes, there has been an agreement that was made in Oman, in Muscat, between what I call the government in Sana'a and the Saudi government. And that truce is still holding. It's temporary for 2 months, but it's still holding, and I think it will continue to hold. I think Saudi Arabia, even the US, decided this war is taking too long, and it's making sort of the enemies, the rivals, become more stronger because more Yemenis are joining the Sana'a government and seeing that this is a struggle against an invader. A Saudi invader backed by the United States and Europe and all of Europe, and with the Ukrainian crisis, with the Russian intervention in Ukraine and all of this sort of bad things happening, it was hard for the American and the British in particular to condemn the Russians in Ukraine, but continue to help bomb Yemen at the same time. So it was. Things are changing on the ground because people in the Middle East now have Twitter, they can research, and the government does not necessarily control more, they are controlling less minds than they did before. So I think a lot of factors have played in terms of trying to end this war in favor of Saudi Arabia and favor of the United States, because like you mentioned earlier before the interview, there have been more people killed in Yemen by American bombs than people in Ukraine who have been killed by Russian bombs. So it shows you sort of this contradiction. You can call it racism, hypocrisy, whatever you want to call it, but it's clear that the reaction to Yemeni kids who have been starved, we're talking about 400,000 kids who have died. And these numbers, you will not hear them being broadcasted too much because it makes the sort of the American position and the Western position sort of look bad because they're supporting this war. But in the other side, where Ukraine, like many, even BBC said, oh, these blue-eyed, blonde hair Europeans, they're not from the Middle East. So this I think creating a lot of, I think, contradiction morally and politically, and I think this is a good time for all of us. Now, I would not point a finger only at the United States and Europe. This is a high time that we, as human beings, really start thinking of kids as kids without looking at their eye color, their origin, their religion or ethnicity. Kids are kids, and we should treat them equally, exactly. The UN has been atrocious when it came to the Yemeni kids. The World Health Organizations have been criminal in terms of stopping delivering cholera medicine a few years ago to Yemenis because they
what kind of medicine?
During the cholera outbreak in Yemen.
Oh, the cholera, yes.
The World Health Organization stopped delivering medicine to Yemen because it was the request of the Saudis and maybe the US as well. So we need to have some. We are in 2022. We are supposedly civilized. I think we can fight. I mean, it's ugly to fight, but at least maintain some nobility in this fight, spare the kids, spare the civilians, the death and starvation. And the starvation of Yemen is one of the largest war crimes that happened in my age, because I haven't seen a siege like this in any country with this number of people, even against Iraq. It was not like this. So we need to stop this sort of practice. These sanctions to me are, like slavery, And my definition of slavery, one of the definition of slavery, that slavery is a set of sanctions. And so that's why we need to end sanctions against that hurts people's food supply, electric supply, their basic human needs must not be sanctioned, no matter who they are.
Now, I saw a tweet about some ships getting into Hodeidah. Is that open now, or is just a few ships?
Yeah, few ships have been allowed, but I just saw, I think yesterday, that a ship has been seized and has not been allowed to deliver. So there is no lifting of the sanctions. There is a partial lifting of the siege. So the war continues, but we don't see a lot of guns firing on both sides. So hopefully it will come because it's a win-win situation. A Yemen that is not at war, a Yemen at peace, will benefit all Yemeni sides. And I think Yemen should come and it's really important to say this Yemenis of all types and backgrounds should come together and form a government representing all of them based on elections and freedoms for all. And those countries involved in the war, including primarily the United States and Saudi Arabia and UAE and UK, these are 4 countries that have been played the major role in the death in Yemen. I think they should set up a fund for compensations to the Yemeni people. I think $500 billion is a good number over 10 years that the US, the UK, and the EU countries with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, and Qatar, and Kuwait, Sudan, and Jordan, those countries who helped kill Yemenis must pay for Yemen's reconstruction. A Marshall Plan is needed. $500 billion is a good number. I think it's not high. It's decent because that country has been subjected for more bombs and bombing than the entirety of Europe in the World War II for 7 years nonstop.
Final question. Some of your most recent tweets were about Mazen Damag, a Yemeni in Ukraine. Could you talk about him?
No, I just retweeted. I think there was a Yemeni student who had this treacherous trip from Kiev to I think either to Romania or to Poland. So this is very common. It happened to African. Ukraine is a white country, but there are students there from Africa, from the Arab countries, and students or citizens who do not have strong governments, like many African governments, and Yemen, obviously, they could not get any help from their government. So they suffered greatly. And while Ukraine is receiving help from Europe, from the United States to combat this, these people basically have been ignored because they happen to be, brown or black. And that should not happen. This is not the time to discriminate between people based on their age. We should always ask, what if I was the person, being discriminated against? How would I feel? So this is a good time to learn from these wars that we should stop treating people based on the skin of their, the color of their skin or their origin or religion or whatever, distinguishing factor that they have.
I understand. Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.